Good evening, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Firas Patel. Say Jazakallah to you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Of course, you just heard President Ramaphosa's speech at the World Economic Forum, and a lot of that was mentioned that after a decade of stagnant growth, state capture, and a health pandemic, South Africa has to accelerate economic growth. Addressing the Brand SA Business Dinner at the WEF, which is currently happening in Davos, Ramaphosa said the structural reforms that were meant to be introduced have set a firm foundation for growth. Team South Africa is currently in Davos to go ahead and sell it as a perfect investment destination going forward. Joining us now to take the discussion forward, I'd like to welcome Standard Bank Chief Economist Goolam Ballim. Goolam, assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Alaikum salam, Faraz. As always, thank you for having me. Very gracious of you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Goolam, when you look at growth, I mean, last week I was at this World Economic Forum media breakfast, and many of business within the country were saying they still believe the 3% growth is possible. You listen to President Ramaphosa, he's insisting on that. Given some of the challenges that are still faced and some of the leaps that have been made, I mean, how far of a realization are we in terms of that 3%?
For us, it's an ambition. It's not possible over the next, say, 12 or 24 months for the economy to get to 3% growth. Even though now our structural or steady state trend level of growth is around 1%, you would think 3% is not that far off. However, to be able to get to 3 and cling to 3 will require a fairly meaningful upgrade in South Africa's infrastructure bedrock. So quite simply, investment leads growth. And to the extent that at least for more than a decade, there's been a general subsidence in the level of investment in South Africa's economy. And so just in terms of speaking as if the economy were an athlete, there's been a great deal of degradation with respect to, say, muscle and bone. We've got to build up that muscle and bone. It's going to require a multi-year investment effort with regard to infrastructure before we can get to, say, 3%. However, not to dampen spirits, directionally, certainly, we're on course for 3% being a potential outcome.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned not dampening the spirits. One thing that hasn't dampened our spirits, I mean, it's just been over 300 days, and that is, of course, no load shedding. Goolam, listening to President Ramaphosa, he mentioned that the country has come a long way in dealing with the energy crisis. We are on par, of course, of trying to get this green energy project going. That's one thing that Team South Africa is selling to many investors across the globe. There's one positive for you, isn't it? And how much now does South Africa need to use that to try and leverage itself as this investment destination?
For us, the gigantic bottlenecks in our economy, which many South Africans, of course, will be familiar with, relate foremost to Eskom and Transnet. Eskom, of course, injects oxygen into the economy, given the primacy of power, not just in domestic, but also in industrial use. And of course, in that respect, we appear to be on a far more sturdier footing. And as we go into 2025, the idea that we won't have power rationing in a meaningful way, if it does occur, is comforting. Transnet is significant for our exports. Exports account for about a third of overall GDP. And to the extent that exports have been hamstrung by Transnet's inefficiencies, and over the, let's say, last few quarters, we're beginning to see a semblance of turnaround. So that's constructive, admittedly from a precarious and a low level, but directionally in terms of either the cargo that's been shipped through the ports, and also in terms of, let's say, Transnet's capability to get goods to ports and the port's efficacy. Both those items are showing early momentum. And if it's sustained, which seems to be quite possible, then that would be a second wind in the sails of economic growth. Of course, the Eskom 3.0, some would call it, is the water crisis that is bedeviling very substantially in Gauteng and also in KwaZulu-Natal. That seems also going to be somewhat precarious and a headwind for the economy over the near to medium term. And solutions are going to be certainly slow in the making. I guess it's kind of stating the obvious. But unlike an electricity grid, which is one gigantic national grid, water is a very local phenomenon. So you could have one suburb that is, for example, entirely water secure, and a neighboring suburb that, due to infrastructure neglect, for example, can suffer very substantial periodic water shortages. So water is going to be dampening our spirits, so to speak, over the near to medium term, and quite possibly into 2026, as local municipalities begin to get to grips with it, particularly in the urban centers. Over and above that, just cyclically, what I'll talk about is the fall in inflation, which is around 3%. It's an incredibly low level. And of course, we've already had interest rate relief and will see more interest rate relief over the first half of this year, certainly the end of this month. The Reserve Bank is likely to cut rates by another quarter of a percentage point. So the inflation decline combined with interest rate relief will be a boon to consumers and will provide some level of thrust to consumer spending through 2025.
Goolam, how much of what happens in Washington is really going to shape what occurs in Pretoria? I ask this because even at the Davos meeting that is currently happening, of course, one of South Africa's biggest challenges is trying to convince the Trump administration that there can still be trade and business between these two capitals. So how much of what happens in the United States is really going to play a role in the way we, of course, function? And I ask that also adding to the potential repo rate cuts, where a lot of what happens in the Fed has this knock-on effect, not just here in South Africa, but across the globe.
It's significant. Of course, your viewers will know the United States accounts for about a quarter of the world's GDP, a little less than that, but close enough. And of course, is significant in terms of, say, the dollar still being the dominant trade currency around the world. And there's other reasons why certainly the United States matters, also in diplomatic circles, as you just mentioned. I think there's two things that stand out. It's not novel. It's been some while now that we've been having elevated levels of multilateral friction, translating into geoeconomic fragmentation. So globalization seems to have hit quite a material speed bump, and in some respects is reversing. So what we witness in the United States is just part and parcel of that trend, where many economies are beginning to look insular, and with that insular posture, they beginning to put up walls, whether it's tariff walls or even just in terms of nearshoring, friendshoring, ally shoring, and reframing the international relations through commerce, and particularly through economic diplomacy. So it's rather perhaps ironic that these business leaders have gathered in Davos, and the elephant in the room was Donald Trump, who, of course, as we know, was inaugurated earlier this week. So I guess many will have gathered then. Donald Trump would have been the topic of conversation in a manner where people anticipated him or speculated, but did not know exactly on Monday what he was going to do. We now know a little bit more a couple of days later. And what is clear is that he's going to rewrite the global rulebook. The rulebook in terms of a rules-based world where there were certain guardrails and understanding, for example, shaped by WTO in terms of trade, NATO in terms of what the West will regard as a defense shield, trade, of course, President Trump mooting tariffs, not just Brazil, Canada, and China, but perhaps possibly other nations, even though over the last few days there's been far less rhetoric and action with regard to trade. But the essence is he's going to be very dominant with regard to American interest. And in typical Trump fashion, he's going to be transactional, seeking quid pro quos. He will want to reindustrialize America, reshore American firms, enhance America's employment capabilities with locals, with indigenous people, rather than necessarily immigrants over the near to medium term. And so I think in boardrooms around the world, people are grappling with the several executive orders that is already signed and what it means.
Goolam, unfortunately, we have come to the end of this conversation. As always, thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That's Standard Bank Chief Economist Goolam Ballim, of course, breaking down how South Africa needs to sell itself within the World Economic Forum basis. Now, sticking on Donald Trump, sticking on the billionaire boys club that he surrounded himself with, billionaires' wealth surged to the trillions mark. Oxfam had reported this just this week. We're going to be speaking to Lebogang Ramafoko from Oxfam South Africa with regards to this. Do stay tuned.